Make no mistake about it, Funkadelic is the reason why punk rock and heavy metal were created. I mean, they tend to give that credit to a lot of other groups, and unfortunately, it just doesn't add up to the historic things that George and them were doing at that time. You know, honestly enough, I always felt that if Eddie Hazel and Funkadelic as a group would have gotten the same exposure as a Led Zeppelin or a Cream or a Black Sabbath, trust me, we wouldn't really be talking about two of those other groups. And that's not to take nothing away from Led and Cream, because I love all those groups and they're a huge influence on me. So I'm just speaking the truth as far as what people really don't understand and know, because a lot of times when you say Parliament Funkadelic, you automatically think Flashlight and One Nation Under a Groove or Tear the Roof Off, which is cool. I mean, it makes sense. I mean, that was a great era that they put together. But, you know, true funk soldiers and people that know their music history already know that Funkadelic is the first black rock, heavy metal, punk rock band there ever was. And they opened the door for a lot of that because, as we all know, heavy metal and punk rock are just subgenres of rock and roll. But George and Eddie and Billy and Tall and Tiki, Bernie, Mickey, you know, they were doing things that nobody was doing in the late 60s or mid to late 60s. If you look at the whole situation with songs like Alice in My Fantasies or Super Stupid, and especially Maggot Brain. I mean, I don't think I have to tell anybody about that, but they were ahead of their time. And George, just on the look department, as far as the costuming and a man that would take a clipper, hair clippers, and shave both sides of his head and leave one head sticking up. And that today we know as the Mohawk. Yes, George Clinton created the Mohawk way before there was ever a subgenre called punk rock, or before anybody even think to have different dye color in their hair or anything like that. George and them were doing that first. So even when they talk about the glam rock era with David Bowie and all these guys, they have to realize that George came first. George was painting his face and with crosses and stuff like that, and rocking this mohawk when nobody was doing it. So that automatically makes George a pioneer. And if you look at the punk rock genre that happened, you know, around the late 70s and early 80s, you know, the mohawk was pretty much like the stereotypical look for a punk rocker. And a lot of times when they talk about these different styles and images in the world of rock and roll music, they fail to mention how much of an important part that George Clinton and the rest of the P-Funk gang played. And on the musical side, they had what I call the greatest dilemma. Why? Because they were too psychedelic for the black audiences, and they were too raw and hardcore black for the white audiences. So in return, that brought a lot of the audiences together, even though they were pretty much the underground's best kept secret on the music scene. And I think one of the main reasons why they have the majority of white fans now, because number one, people went back and did their research, and number two, when George Clinton was hired to produce Red Hot Chili Peppers' debut called Freaky Styley, and that in return introduced Red Hot Chili Peppers audience to who George Clinton was, because a lot of them were probably figuring out why is Red Hot Chili Peppers working with this crazy looking black dude, and that's when, of course, thank God for Anthony and Chad and Flea and all those guys, because they let it be known that Funkadelic was the reason why they became a band. And as we all know, Red Hot Chili Peppers will go on to become one of the most successful and most creative rock groups there is, but they always pledge allegiance to the influence of Funkadelic. And then next thing you know, you have people like Rage Against the Machine um, covering Alice in My Fantasies and copping a lot of licks from that time period. This is why I always say, you know, if you look at the lineage going from Funkadelic, if it wasn't for Funkadelic, there would be no Bad Brains, there would be no Fishbone, there would be no Living Color, there would be no Lenny Kravitz, and they definitely would not be any Prince or Rick James for that matter, because they were doing something that nobody was doing. I mean, George Clinton was even doing country music when at the time the only black dude we had in country music was Charlie Pride. So way before Lionel Richie put his stamp on it, you listen to Parliament's Little Old Country Boy, which is basically funk meets country, and that was straight up and down George showing that he loved all kinds of music. But of course, because of the racial division within the record labels, um, the artists were always trying to be told what they couldn't do or what type of style of music they should be doing, and that still exists today. I mean, you know, a lot of times when a black artist decides to do something different from the normal hip hop or regular contemporary R&B stuff, they're considered alternative, weird, or they came up with the term neo soul. Neo soul was actually a good term when it first started because, as we know, neo means new in Greek, so it meant new soul. It basically was old school vintage 60s, 70s, 80s soul being done by some 90s, 2000 young cats. So it just made a lot of sense. But after a while, the image began to get more conversation than the music, and that's the reason why people like Erica Badu and a couple other folks, they really revolted against that genre because, you know, they wanted to be known that we could do all types of music. I mean, personally for me, Erica Badu's best album, in my opinion, is Mama's Gun because she went all over the place with that album, even deeper than what she did on her classic first album. That's just my opinion. But Funkadelic had a lot to do with things like that because they opened the gateway to be aggressively different, to be raw, to be powerful, to be loud, to come up with different concepts and just kind of grow. Because if you notice, every Funkadelic album was different from each other. Free Your Mind didn't sound like Stand on the Verge. Stand on the Verge didn't sound like Cosmic Slop, and Cosmic Slop did not sound like America Eats Us Young. So it was a whole array of that. So I encourage people to go and listen to the first 6 or 7 Funkadelic albums to understand why they are in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. Yet they never won a Grammy, never won a American Music Award, or any of that. But their influence can never ever be denied. So for people, when you talk about rock and roll and you don't mention Funkadelic's strong influence in that department, then you really don't know what's happening.